Well, guys, this is Kara Collier. She is here today from the company NutriSense. They are over on Instagram. You're all over the place, but Instagram's where I hang out most of the time. So I find you over there, NutriSense.io. I remember when I first saw that, I was like, NutriSenseo. I thought it was like a karate something. I didn't know what it was, but NutriSense is spelled NutriSense, and then put IO. And of course, your website is NutriSense.io. That's why the IO is there.
Yeah.
For a loop there for a while. It's like, am I signing up for karate? My blood sugar?
No, yeah. I guess the .com was taken, right?
Yes. Yeah, you only have so many choices when it comes to when .com is taken. Okay, we're not an ORG. We're not TV. We're not, like, you have to like go through it. This one is my friends at Keto Chow. They have ketochow.xyz. I thought, I've never seen XYZ.
I've never seen that.
Oh, yeah. Well, welcome. And yes, guys, she is from a company that talks about what I'm talking about literally all the time. People are always asking Kara about CGMs, these continuous glucose monitors. And you guys were very kind to send me your nice little package in the mail. It's got the logo right there, NutriSense. What's it say on the side? Get ready to know you better. And then you open it up. See, we're showing everybody in real time. This is what you get when you sign up with NutriSense. You get this nice little package that's got the CGM. So that's the applicator. There's the big bad needle. It's not bad at all. But that people fear. And then you provide these things to help to keep it on a little better. I don't usually wear these because I guess I don't sweat enough for it to fall off, but people like these because it does.
Yeah, it seems to be like totally person specific. I've never worn one, and I have a hard time peeling them off at the end of 2 weeks. But some people, if they don't wear the bandage, one day in and it falls off. So I think it just depends on your skin.
And you're a girl, so you don't have a lot of hairs back there.
No, yeah.
I'm a guy, and so I've got hairs back there on the back of my arm. I literally, pro tip, guys, shave the back and put it on. You will be so glad when you go to pull it off. It's not the pulling it off that's bad. It's the ripping of all those hairs coming out that makes it bad.
Yeah, that's so true.
You have this little card in there, shows you how to go about doing it, how you can sign up. Just so many things. Like, you guys are pros at this. You definitely have been trying to make accessibility to continuous glucose monitors so much easier and better. So thank you for that. For the longest time, it's been a drought. Like, people are like, I want one, but wait, I have to talk to my doctor about getting one. Wait, well, he doesn't want to because I don't have diabetes. Like, it's all of those things. And we'll get into all that here today. But why don't we start with how you got involved with this company?
Yeah, so I'm a registered dietitian, and my background, I was working in hospitals, particularly ICUs. So I was seeing a lot of really, really sick people, right? The sickest of the sick. And that was a very frustrating experience for somebody who's trying to help people. So I'm seeing people come into the hospital with chronic lifestyle related conditions. Not often are they actually coming in with acute injuries or illnesses, but instead it's a complication of diabetes or heart disease or kidney disease.
Right.
And then seeing people way too late. And I know if we could have caught them earlier and helped prevent it, then they wouldn't have to have been in the ICU. So that was my early experience. It was just very, very frustrating. And I also felt like the system itself was not trying to get at the root of these problems. They're just trying to address the symptoms and get you home as soon as possible. But then they come back in because a real problem was never being addressed, unfortunately.
I have had people on this podcast, Kara, that are medical professionals, nurses, doctors, and they all articulate exactly what you said. The system is broken, which is functional medicine doctors who are very big fans of CGMs. Even like nutritionally minded chiropractors, so many kind of alternative health people. They're the ones that are actually helping people. All the rest in kind of this mainstream medical system with chronic disease, they keep getting progressively worse and worse and worse. And nobody is just going, whoa, 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 like you did. You're like, it's so obvious to me we're not getting the root.
Absolutely. So it's so frustrating. A lot of people are starting to realize that they can't make the change they want to make in the current system. So a lot of people are jumping ship. They're making their own practices where they can actually do what they want to do, or starting companies where they can address these issues. So that's the route I decided to go. I was like, I can't make meaningful change in the healthcare system like I want to, just because of the system itself.
I'm
And
curious. Can I
yeah.
ask you, how are you bucking the system? Because a lot of registered dietitians don't really give a rip about your blood sugar. I know, okay, they give lip service. Yes, we care
Yeah.
about your blood sugar, but then they're recommending the very foods that we know spike blood sugar the most. So
Yeah.
how do you reconcile that in your mind, and how did you come to, I guess, believing blood sugar was a relevant marker?
Yeah, great question. And part of the frustration I had in those early experiences was, if I could get through to somebody, a patient was willing to listen, even though, I'm catching them 40 years too late.
Right.
The recommendations I was giving didn't seem to be working. So it was just being aware enough of like, okay, I'm taught this one thing and I'm practicing that, but it's not really moving the needle. It's not improving somebody's outcome. And now, that I've seen thousands of people's continuous glucose data, it's even more apparent how ineffective or harmful those recommendations were. Because you see, when somebody has full-blown diabetes, insulin resistance, what even just a little bit of like a whole grain does to someone's glucose values. Like if we were taught that in school, like if we could see just one screenshot of somebody's continuous glucose data as a
Right.
diabetic, it is so stark how different it is between somebody who doesn't have insulin resistance.
Well, and to me, companies like yours, you have the data. It's very sleek on the. I'm going to pull up the little app you have for your
Mm-hmm.
people can see, but it's so sleek, and it's able to be accessed by medical professionals and dietitians that can help interpret what the data means, look for trends. Like that technology exists, and yet there's kind of this, I don't want to know. If I don't see the information, it doesn't exist. And it's kind of crazy to me that if they're truly about health, they would want to see the totality of health, which includes your blood sugar.
Absolutely. There's so many dietitians who are like, I don't understand what you're doing, or why would anybody who's not diabetic be wearing a CGM? I do get pushback in the dietitian world, which is so unfortunate, because we're supposed to be the leaders in the nutrition space that are helping you with this. But so many people are just stuck in the traditional teachings and not really thinking for themselves, unfortunately. Research and science and recommendations are skewed and biased and lagging, and we have to be able to think for ourselves. What I think like my teaching, my dietetics, training did well was it taught me, how does the body work, like the basic mechanisms of biochemistry and metabolism. And then, the second half of my training is applying this with recommendations that are outdated or ineffective. But if you can at least take that original training and you understand how the body works, you can come to your own conclusions that are more meaningful. And so it requires somebody who's willing to think for themselves, which is a rare, I think, skill, not just in dietitians, but everyone, right? Our brains are lazy. We want to default to the lazy thinking and not really dig into the research or really dig into the mechanisms and think for yourself of critical thinking. How does this work? But if you can do that, then you can come up with conclusions and recommendations that make a lot more sense and are actually effective.
Part of the challenge of getting people to pay attention to their blood sugar, especially listening to mainstream dietitians and medical health professionals, is everybody seems to still be obsessing about the calories. And so as long as you focus on calories, you basically negate the macronutrients at that point. And so therefore anything that would be impactful on blood sugar, oh, well, you're within a calorie range. And I know they kind of teach that probably heavily within the teachings, like you were just saying, the very poor nutritional teachings in dietetic school. That's the problem, though. People obsess about calories. They're not being told blood sugar is a whole lot more important than the calories. How do you, as a dietitian, get people to unlearn some of the misinformation about calories and ignoring macronutrients, for example, and now paying attention to things like blood sugar, inflammation, insulin, and all the rest?
Yeah, great question. And it's not just calories. So I think the best way to show this to people is to show them real data. When you have real data coming at you, especially if it's coming from your own body, if you can put one of these sensors on somebody who's on the fence, it becomes way more meaningful and way more apparent where it's like, okay, I can't just eat my calorie recommendations of pasta and cereal all day and have good glucose control. It doesn't matter. It's not just about energy load. It's also about macronutrients, and it's also about the quality of your macronutrients, right? And a lot of times what in the dietitian circle or traditional teaching, when we say quality of macronutrients, dietitians are thinking, okay, well, that's whole wheat bread or whole wheat pasta, and that's not a quality carbohydrate. I'm not, you should never have carbohydrates. Like, some people can tolerate a certain amount. We all have totally different thresholds, but nobody really should be eating whole wheat bread or whole wheat pasta. That's no longer a whole food. That's still a refined, processed carbohydrate. And that's where I think a big mismatch in like what traditional dietitians think and how the body actually works. We're not processing that like we're processing a sweet potato or we're processing some other actual whole food carbohydrate. So there's a big mismatch in just what is a healthy carbohydrate versus what is our body meant to be processing.
Well, I'm the keto guy. I wrote a
Yeah.
in this space, Keto Clarity. And so people will often say, what's a keto? Even today, I've written 7 books on ketogenic diets and they still write me, what's a keto? What's a blood glucose? And so we have those people at a very rudimentary lack of knowledge of anything about this. Then you've got people who kind of casually kind of follow along. Okay, they generally know what blood glucose is, but then they're the kind of people that say, well, I don't have diabetes. Why do I need to test my blood glucose? So as the continuous glucose monitor company, NutriSense, tell people, make the case for why people need to be testing it, even if they don't have a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, well, the first is that most people have worse glucose control than they actually realize. Traditional ways to measure your glucose would be like if you went to a doctor, you would get 2 things, maybe a fasting glucose value and a hemoglobin A1C. Both of these have a lot of flaws and they're a little bit lagging in catching some of these glucose related issues. So fasting glucose value inherently is just a snapshot in time, right? But it's also only telling us what's happening in the fasted state. It tells us nothing about how our body is processing food.
And generally measured in the morning, which some people have this thing called the Shimoji effect, dawn phenomenon, bearing effect, whatever you call it. And it tends to be a false elevation. So then what do they do with it? Like, my doctor literally never said anything about that number, no matter what it was, that fasting glucose number, partly because didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah. And one of the biggest drivers for an increased fasting glucose value is cortisol. So you had a bad night of sleep the night before, or if you're under stress, you might get back a fasting glucose value that's in the diabetic level. But if you sleep the next night, it could be totally normal the next day. So it is a rudimentary marker. It's still useful, but another nuance of fasting glucose is that what we want it to be consistently in trends is between 70 and 90. And traditionally, if you go to the doctor and your value is 99, they might say, that's normal, you're good to go. But there's a lot of evidence that when we're getting to the 90 to 100 range, that we're starting to see increased risk for all these insulin resistance related conditions. So if you are checking it regularly and not just one random snapshot in time, we do want to see in that 70 to 90 range.
Well, and sometimes younger people will say, well, I'm young, I can mitigate any response, but that's when the disease starts. I recently read a study. I do a show here on this studio called Jimmy Rants, the name of the show. And I did a study recently about these Japanese girls, 20 years old on average, and they wanted to see if the pace at which they ate their food had an impact on their blood sugar. This would be really cool if they were wearing your meter and having all the tracking data. But they had them eat the meal, all 3 meals in the day in 10 minutes. You had to finish it within 10 minutes. That was the fast. Or 20 minutes. That was the slow. And what they found was you had a greater increase in your blood sugar as a direct result of eating faster, which I assume it's because you're putting the carbohydrates in there much so then it gets absorbed quicker, thus the higher blood sugar. But the key finding when I kind of dug into the study was really fascinating to me, Kara. These 20-year-olds who are supposedly healthy, and they called them in the study healthy, non-insulin resistant, insulin sensitive, their 2-hour postprandial of these girls, so they had their typical diet, lots of rice in there, 256 blood sugar, 2 hours postprandial.
What were they eating?
They're not healthy. They were eating lots of rice, lots of carbohydrates. Look up the study. If you just put in Japan study, you should be able to find it in a DuckDuckGo search. But wow, I mean, I looked at that and I went, and like total for the day, they had almost 600 grams of carbohydrate, which is a typical, that's why they did it that way. It's a typical kind of Japanese standard diet, kind of have an American standard American diet. But I was shocked because these are the supposedly healthy girls, and yet they had 2-hour postprandial that showed, oh my God, they're already progressing towards that insulin resistance, diabetes, if they keep at that over the years.
Yeah, that would certainly be if somebody, no matter what you're eating, I don't care if you just ate like 200 grams of straight sucrose, I would not want to see your glucose go that high. A healthy metabolism should be able to process that and deal with that glucose load, no matter how big it is, and not have glucose values reach that threshold. So that is certainly a sign of, insulin resistance on some scale. It could be early or late, but it would definitely be a red flag. And a lot of people, if they throw CGMs on people who don't have a diabetes diagnosis, a lot of people are reaching these impaired glucose tolerance levels. So I think a study that was over like 1,000 participants had 93% of people crossed impaired glucose tolerance threshold. So a lot of people have worse glucose control than they realize.
And that goes to the study where they found that 87% of the American population has some level of insulin resistance, which would make their blood dysregulation be exaggerated. And so it makes sense that, 93 is pretty statistically close to 87%.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, and that's true. So that's based off of like metabolic dysfunction. So any sort of glucose dysregulation, cholesterol dysregulation, all of those play a part in insulin resistance, which eventually will show up in dysregulated glucose values. And that's the thing where there's a lot of these traditional lab markers. If you're only getting your labs checked once a year, which a lot of 20, 30-year-olds who think they're healthy, even if, they might be in normal weight, they might not be checking labs at all. But these can show up normal, and you might have early stages, early symptoms of insulin resistance that you're not catching. A lot of times we're not seeing on traditional lab markers like fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C, we're not seeing you enter prediabetes levels until, you've had 10 years of some insulin resistance happening in the background. And that's one of the reasons the CGM is so helpful, because you can catch these issues way, way quicker and way easier than you would see on even a glucose meter at home, but especially these traditional lab markers you would get from your doctor, because you can do things like eat a bunch of carbohydrates and see how your body responds. You can see the exact shape of the postprandial response. You can see these trends, like what is my fasting glucose actually day in and day out, not just when I get a bad night of sleep. And that's really where the insights lie.
Sorry, you have a hesitation that makes me think you're talking, so I keep trying to talk.
It's okay.
I'll catch your drift here in a second. So, but that's the fun of wearing a CGM, is you kind of get to tinker and test around. I love seeing all these people talking about your company. I see them on Instagram, or even just people in general that slap one on and they're, oh my gosh, I want to experiment to see what happens with, and then they do some protocol. And of course you can sit there and do it in real time. I did it before using the Freestyle Libre and like eating just a pound of chicken. I just wanted to see what would happen eating a pound of chicken. I knew I felt bad when I just ate a leaner meat, but quantifiably what would happen. And I saw baseline was 82, perfectly fine. Then I saw within 15 minutes, it was up about 5 points. Within 30 minutes, it was up to 87, 8, something like that. And then suddenly I got 45 minutes in, I was starving. I started to feel weak. I was having hypoglycemia. and it crashed eventually down into the upper 60s, which isn't bad, but still, when your baseline is 82 and you're at 69 within like an hour, hour and a half, that ain't good. Something's wrong.
Yeah.
And so I've talked to a few doctors about it, and they're like, well, maybe you have a glucagon issue going on, or maybe it's just that chicken is insulinogenic when eaten solo versus adding in fat.
Right.
About 2.5 hours post-prandial, and it finally got to 78 again. I'm like close enough to 82, and I went in there. I've got backyard chickens. I made some eggs cooked in grass-fed butter, and within 15 minutes of eating that meal, I felt better again because my blood sugar had normalized, and I was watching it with the CGM. But like, people would feel that and go, oh, this keto thing makes me feel bad.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That it's the kind of food they ate that made them feel bad, not the presence of ketosis or the lower blood sugar.
Yeah, and the macros make a big difference. And that's some people all the time, they start the program. Everybody gets a dietitian assigned to them with our program because this stuff is confusing and glucose values aren't always self-explanatory. But people all the time are like, tell me exactly what to eat, exactly what macros. Yeah. And it's like, it's very personalized. Like, I cannot give you a one size fits all. I know that's like the exciting answer everyone wants, is to tell you exactly what to do. But the best way to find out is to have real data and experiment, try different things. So one of the biggest things a lot of people are doing, even if they're not eating any carbohydrates, is tinkering with their fat to protein ratios, figuring out which macros really fit for them optimally. And what types of protein, what types of fat, because everyone responds a little differently. Yeah. That's super interesting with the chicken. Like, we know that protein stimulates both insulin and glucagon, which is interesting. So normally glucose levels should be pretty stable with protein, but for something that's more insulinogenic like chicken, you could have a glucose drop like that, especially if you're doing nothing else with it. It's an interesting experiment. I might have to try that.
And my theory is, I would love to hear what your results are trying it. My theory is that when you have insulin resistance long enough, which I used to weigh 410 pounds and I've had issues with insulin resistance for most of my life, that eventually you also develop glucagon resistance so that it doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to. So those of you that don't know, insulin pushes the blood sugar down, glucagon pushes it back up, trying to keep you in that tight range of the 70 to 90 like Sarah was talking about. And so when it gets down that way, all I know is I'm sprawled out on the couch, reclining back saying, oh, please, Lord, don't take me home today. Because it was just miserable. But that's the fun part of wearing a CGM, is you got this little thing in the back of your arm is where I put it. You can put it on your belly. I've seen people put it on their leg. I've seen it everywhere. Don't put it here. That would be weird. But like, people can see in real time what's happening with their blood sugar. And it's like, you don't have to constantly prick. That's the fun thing. That old, and you're too young to remember this, but there was this old infomercial that says, set it and forget it. And so you set it in there and you forget it's in there for 2 weeks, and you can, on a whim, just bloop, 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 and get the data.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the beauty of having a continuous glucose monitor over a glucose meter at home is, first of all, I'm not having to draw any blood. I don't like pricking my finger. I do it because I want to know the data, but a lot of people are never even going to do it because they don't want to prick their finger. And as you said in the beginning, to insert this in the back of your arm, there is a small needle for insertion, but that needle doesn't even stay in the skin. And I promise you, it does not hurt.
You know what hurts more is just the pressure of that adhesive.
Yeah.
But
if you have the type of skin like us, yeah.
Squeezes your skin and you're just like, okay, I'm good. It's just that little moment of, okay, I'm good. But I have a little trick, a little hack so that doesn't. So as I'm going, I've got it up against the skin. I'm like, I'll do this. And I'll push it down as I'm blowing out hard, and I don't feel anything.
Awesome. Yeah, for me, I never feel anything when I put it on. So people are always scared because you will see a needle during insertion, but I promise you, it does not hurt. Like, definitely pricking your finger hurts a lot more because you're actually drawing blood.
Yeah.
But that's one of the amazing benefits, is it just stays on there for 2 full weeks. You can shower with it, you can exercise with it. People are always like, am I allowed to do my normal activities? You can engage in normal activities. The patch is there if you happen to be really a sweaty person or someone with sweaty, slippery skin, but you could do your normal activities, and then 24/7 you're getting this data, and you just get it onto the app that we have, and glucose data is there. So you wake up in the morning, you want to know what was happening while you were sleeping, you check, and it pulls all the data all night long. And so that's another thing, is we never have any idea what's happening while we're sleeping, because you're not checking your glucose in the middle of the night. I wouldn't recommend doing if you
wake up and I'm wearing a CGM, I'm like,
oh, if you're wearing a CGM.
And the fun part is that's where it's really low. Like when you're chill and when you're sleeping well, and it's cool in my room. I do all the things for optimal sleep, and I wear the Oura Ring to track it. I'll sometimes get mid 60s, and I'm perfectly fine. I'm not hypoglycemic like I was in the chicken. And I'll see those, and I'm like, oh, I'm doing well. Like it's fun to see that. But yeah, don't wake yourself up to
don't wake yourself up to check it. But if you happen to wake up, you can.
It automatically. I know there's some of these companies that have these little sensors that put it on the outside that automatically send it to an app. Are you guys working on anything like that?
Yeah, there are some. So the Dexcom and the new Libre 2 use Bluetooth technology so that it's streaming automatically 24/7 with the phone. That's really great if you have, especially like type 1 diabetes, and you might be getting low in the night and you need it to stream automatically, alert you and say, wake up, like something's wrong. Those are more expensive because it's more advanced technology. And so we're choosing to use the one where you have to physically scan it, and it holds up to 8 hours of data at a time. So you can go 8 hours without scanning, and then you'll see the rest of the data. Because we're working with non-diabetics. We don't need it to urgently stream to your phone. If you buy one of those devices yourself, the more expensive one, you can just do our software and our dietitian if you want to pay more for it. But we're not buying the more expensive devices because we're trying to make it as accessible as possible to people. So
you guys are missing a business opportunity, because there are a lot of nerdy biohackers out there that would love to have that every 5 minutes reading all throughout the day, because the more data points means the more accurate. Be surprised. You could call it the NutriSense Pro package or something, and people would be willing to shell out the money. You should think about that. I'm serious.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and we certainly could. And we have a lot of people who, they'll get the device from their doctor on their own, and they're like, I want to use your software though, because the software that comes with the Libre it's just glucose data, right? Like it's literally just your glucose data. You can't really do anything with it. You can't manipulate it. You can't log anything with it. So that's why we were like, there has to be better software for this glucose data. So like with ours, you can log your meals, log your activities, your stress, your sleep. You can see different graphs and analytics. So a lot of people will get these more expensive devices and then use our software. But we could definitely just give it to people for a higher charge. That's a good idea, Jimmy.
Would be surprised. Trust me.
Yeah.
I've been a long time, and people are you've got the people that are novices that will never put on a CGM. Then you've got the people that are curious that may or may not. Then you've got the people who are like really into their nutrition and trying to optimize it. That's your target market. And then you got the people that are the wackadoodle nerdy people, by the way, that would go for all the data you could possibly give them. So think about it. I think it would be really worthwhile. But let's talk about that software. Again, NutriSense, and I've got it up here on the screen so you can see all of the data that's available. Obviously, there's nothing in there because I'm not wearing one right now, but you can track your meals. You got advanced. You can type in your dinner, what exercise you've done. Alex is saying, hey, we've seen you had an old version of NutriSense. Talking to you guys. It's really good. Talk about the software that's available.
Yeah, so with our app, obviously the primary feature is your continuous glucose data. So that's on the dashboard, and you can log any sort of event or meal to compare it with. So I can log what I ate with my macros right on there, and then I can compare, okay, how did that meal compare to yesterday when I tried a little bit more fat and a little less protein? And so I can compare these meals right next to each other, see my 2-hour postprandial response for each meal. So we're doing a lot of easy comparison of meal experiments and what your optimal diet is. But then also, there's things like analytics. So I can see standard deviation over time. I can see how today's compares to yesterday's, how my average glucose of today compares to yesterday, or this week compared to last week. So you're getting to really see the nuances, because what's important about this continuous glucose data is the trends. So we're talking about if you go to a doctor and you get a fasting glucose value, it might be useful, it might not, but what's really useful about a continuous glucose monitor is you're getting to see those trends. So some people will wake up with fasting glucose of 91 day, and then it's like, okay, yesterday it was 70, so what did I do different in between these 2 days? Oh, last night I ate really late, even though it was my normal, steak and broccoli, but I ate 3 hours later than normal, and that's going to raise my glucose values, even though I didn't have any carbohydrates. So you can pick out these different nuances with these trends, and we have charts and analytics to help you do that. Then we also have the dietitian support. So you got a little message in there from Alex telling you to update your app, but that's where the messages from the dietitians come as well. So they can see your data and they can look at it and say like, hey, I noticed this weird trend in your fasting glucose, like maybe try eating a little bit earlier. So they can kind of point out these different nuances that you might not be able to realize if you're not a glucose expert. So our goal is to take people from glucose novice to glucose expert. So eventually you're like, I know the ins and outs of exactly what's happening, all these trends, and you're good to go on your own. And then also, some people use the dietitian for more traditional reasons of, I have a lot of weight to lose. I want somebody to help me figure out a plan and hold me accountable. Like we can do that too. But our primary goal is to make you a glucose expert. And so that's what the dietitians are there for.
Okay, Kara, I'm going to offer another suggestion. NutriSense should be paying me consulting fees. Another suggestion, you've got like dinner, you've got like exercise as categories that you can input. You're missing a really big one that I think is important anyway. Adverse/stressful events. I have found when I'm wearing a CGM, if I get a distressing phone call or if I have something like a car accident that just jars me, you can log that event and then watch the blood sugar. And a lot of people get a major blood sugar response to even just a stressfulness in their life. I think that's a missing data point that you as a dietitian would see. Well, what happened at like 2 p.m. yesterday? You didn't eat anything? Did you exercise? Because it'll look like an exercise response. No, but I got a call from my mom, said my grandfather's in the hospital and about ready to die. Well, there's an event that you could log and then track those over time and look at the differentiation between those. Just a suggestion. I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Stress is a huge one. And we have the ability to log like your daily stress on a scale of 1 to 5. Yeah.
I think it would be helpful. What is that event? But you're right, kind of a chronic stress in a day on a scale of 1 to 10. What was it? 8. COVID-19 has made it 8 for everybody this year. So.
Too many days in a row. Yeah. And that's a good point. We do have the ability to add like a note. So if there's something you want to capture that isn't in like a predetermined field, like we have things for exercise, for meditation, sleeps, like those type of categories. So you can log a note and that will show up on the graph. And so people will use that for like feeling kind of sick today or crampy, moody, stressed. So you can capture these things that you want to remember, like this day was a little different. So you can at least like write like a blank note type of thing. But stress is a big one. So those acute stress events, people are always shocked the first time something like that happens. They're like, could my glucose really go up to 140 just because I was arguing with my boss? And it's like, it can go even higher too. Or a lot of people, when we used to be driving more, not working from home, people stuck in traffic or commuting to work, and that was their highest glucose values of the day, even though they're fasted, they're not doing anything food or drink related, but they're stressed because they're in traffic and they're running late for work, and their glucose values are high for that whole hour of their commute. And so it's seeing that reinforcement, then you can be like, okay, I need to do something different, because every single day when I'm driving to work, to and from work, I'm having these higher glucose values. I need to learn to de-stress or to not get so angry when I'm driving, or these different moments. And when people have this data where you can connect something that normally feels hard to quantify, like stress, and Oura Ring helps do this as well, where you have this data to help quantify something that normally people are like, I'm not stressed, no, I'm fine. And it's like, well, that was a stress response right there. And so it can help people to realize, oh, I need to be doing something different in these moments, or I need to have more of an unwind at night so that I'm not having these higher values. at night when I'm ruminating or stressed over something, anxious. We're seeing that a lot now. Obviously, this is a time where people are a little more stressed than normal. So it's especially important that people can recognize that connection.
And that's the beauty of data. Like, I would rather know, Kara, that my blood sugar goes crazy. When I find out something distressing has happened and I see my blood sugar in real time, no wonder I feel flushed. No wonder I feel hyped. No wonder I'm getting that hyperglycemia happening, even though no carbohydrates, no nothing is going in my body. I want to see those things. Oh, by the way, one interesting thing that lowers my blood sugar, and I've done it probably a dozen times wearing a CGM. When I go in my infrared sauna, within 5 to 10 minutes, my blood sugar, like clockwork, drops 15 to 20 points.
Really? That's interesting.
Clockwork.
Do you see any spike just from the heat itself, and then it goes down? Oh, interesting.
No, it literally is at baseline, and I'm literally every minute for 10 minutes in a row checking with Again, I'm a nerd, so I'm doing all that data. But I was shocked the first time I saw it. I wrote one of my medical doctor friends who's into CGMs, Dr. John Lemansky, and I said, John, my blood sugar goes down in the sauna. He's like, oh yeah, I meant to tell you that. I'm like, it's cool, right? Isn't that good?
It's okay, right?
And then I replicated it. Like, don't just get one time and say, oh, it always does that. No, I did it a dozen times, and every single time, on average, 15 to 20 points within 5 to 10 minutes. And you're only in there, maybe a 20-minute session. If you've got an elevation in your blood sugar, it might be a way to bring it down. It's an idea.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what you said, repetition is key. Like, if you have a one-time spike from something, which is why it's helpful to have the CGM as well. It's very easy to replicate as opposed to having to check your glucose 3 times to check that postprandial response or whatever is happening. Our body is complex, and things happen sometimes for other reasons. So always repeat something if you think, I should never eat this food again because I just had a spike, unless it's something we know probably shouldn't be eating. Then replicate it, see what happens. But a lot of people in the sauna will have an initial little spike just from the heat and like the fluid shift. But then it is very well documented in the research and in just what we've seen that then they'll have lower values the rest of the day, because it's like exercise. See the same thing with exercise. If you're doing high intensity exercise or heavy weightlifting, you might see a little glucose spike while you're exercising. And that's just the body giving you the glucose it needs to fuel the workout. You don't have to have any carbohydrates in your system to fuel that workout. Your body can do that on its own, but you should see lower glucose values the rest of the day. So this type of spike isn't harmful like a spike from food, because your body's using that energy right away. It wants that glucose. And it's not as insulin dependent glucose uptake, because your muscles are in this very hypersensitive mode to pick up the glucose and use it for energy. There's a reason your body's making it. It wants it.
I can't tell you how many people write me, Kara, and they'll say, oh no, I exercise and now I have a blood sugar of 160. I'm like, sounds pretty normal. And they're like, what? I have no ketones. I'm not burning fat. I'm like, give it 2 hours, relax, just go chill out and watch the magic happen. And almost invariably, blood sugar's back down to normal, maybe even a little bit lower than before they started exercising. And then their ketones go back up again. And I'm like, are you still worried? Oh, no. Like, they don't think about the acuteness of what that vigorousness of your releasing glycogen stores. Even in the most carnivore keto person, you still got glycogen in there that's going to be released into the bloodstream. It's got to show up somehow, and it shows up in blood sugar.
Exactly. Yeah, our body is amazing, and it's able to fuel what activity you need to do, no matter if you're bringing in carbs from food or not. So it has all these pathways it can rely on to fuel that exercise. But doing any type of exercise, whether it's weightlifting or aerobic or HIIT, it's going to lower your glucose values the rest of the day. There is really nothing like exercise to help improve insulin sensitivity at the cellular level. So, maybe normally you have like a meal with carbohydrates on a day you don't exercise, you're probably going to have a way higher glucose spike than on a day you do exercise. So let's say you exercise in the morning and you may eat that meal 6 hours later. You're still going to have a lower glucose response because you're in such a higher insulin sensitivity state because of that exercise. It's really powerful. And even small movements. So going on a leisurely 15-minute walk after a meal, breaking up sitting throughout the day with movement. All of these things are really, really helpful to improve your glucose values and improve your insulin sensitivity. Our bodies like to move. We were meant to move.
I like to move it, move it.
Yeah.
Gascar, is that where that came from?
I think so.
So let's talk about what is actually measured. When that needle goes in there into your arm, it's not actually testing blood. People think, oh, is it testing my blood? Is it going deep enough to get blood? No, it's testing, guys, this thing called interstitial fluid. So can you explain what that is and how it's as accurate as testing finger pricking blood?
Yeah, so it's measuring interstitial fluid, which is just the fluid around your cells. So it's not even going as deep as blood level, which is why another reason it's very comfortable. You don't feel it. It's not going deep at all. And so this is different than the glucose in your blood, but it's still just as accurate. So a lot of this works on a diffusion. So let's say I just ate a bunch of carbohydrates. It's going to show up in my blood first, and then it's going to diffuse into my interstitial fluid. So if you just ate a meal, you might see a 15 to 40 minute lag time between your blood values and the interstitial, because it just works on this diffusion. But eventually it's going to show up there and even out throughout your body, but it's never going to perfectly match. I listened to you talking about the study of comparing accuracy of CGM, so we can definitely touch on this, because the people who love the data and are very nerdy about it, they're checking their glucose meter, their blood value, comparing it to the CGM, and it's not always going to perfectly match, because one's blood and one's interstitial fluid, and one's in your finger and one's in your arm. They're in different areas of your body. They're not exactly the same at the exact same time, but these devices are made for diabetics, and they are proven to be accurate within a certain wiggle range. So they could be a little high or they could be a little low. And we actually allow the ability to manually calibrate in our app, which isn't offered with the normal Libre app. And so if you check a finger stick, it's 20 points off. You can adjust that, and then the whole 14 days are adjusted. But the trends in glucose have been shown to be very precise. And so while the absolute value could be a little higher or a little lower than true value, those trends have shown to be spot on, and which is why they're approved and used for diabetics, because that's what's really important, is how much is my glucose rising in response to a meal, right? What is the trend between yesterday's morning and this morning? But it is measuring something different, interstitial fluid, but it's still glucose in your value in your blood, and it's still accurate, right? It's still telling you what's happening inside of your body.
People get so anal retentive though about like accuracy of number. Oh, well, Freestyle Libre, it's so off. And I'm going, all right, but if you eat an apple and it goes up 50 points, isn't that an actual 50-point rise? Regardless of what the absolute number is when you start. Let's say it's 90 and it's actually 99. Okay, within 10 points, but the change that happens, it's not going to show you have a 60-point spike when it's actually a 20-point spike. It's just not going to do that. So as with anything, I tell people, use these things as tools, and the tools will show you the trend, and it's the trend that matters more than the absolute numbers.
Exactly. And then we apply metrics on each meal. So let's say you tried an apple. On that meal card, it's going to tell you what was my starting glucose, what was my ending glucose 2 hours later, what was the delta in between that. So how high did I rise? And then what's my area under the curve? So those metrics, they don't depend on the absolute value, right? That's your change in glucose and the shape of your postprandial response. And so those values are going to be very insightful to tell you what type of meals are working better for you, what meal timing is working better for you. But then also, yeah, seeing the trend in fasting values and overnight values, all of that's very useful. We do allow the ability to adjust that manual calibration again, because people get very harped on it. But another thing to mention is the glucose meters. I think people are used to them, and so they're seeing them as the gold standard, but they're not the gold standard. Many times I've checked my glucose on one finger and then the other finger, and they're saying 20 points different. They have been studied and researched, and they're not perfect or without fault. There's definitely some variability in the glucometers as well. So when people are comparing something that has variability to the CGM, it can open up, even more variability if the glucose meter isn't even exactly accurate.
Speaking of studies, has there been any research or any researchers that have reached out to you guys wanting to use the NutriSense technology and platform and everything in their research yet? Has that happened?
Yeah, so we are working with 2 different health clinics. One is they specialize in autoimmune disorders, and there's very little research on continuous glucose data and autoimmune conditions. So he's very interested in that and is putting them on his patients to see what sort of outcomes and what sort of a relationship there is there. And then another is he runs a medical facility up in Canada, and he wants to put these on all of his physicians to improve physician burnout and physician wellness, because who doesn't take care of themselves is medical care professionals. So we really need to make sure that our physicians and our doctors and nurses, dietitians are also taking care of themselves and know this information so that they can help their patients. So I'm really, really excited about that. And those results will be turned into a research study eventually. It takes quite a bit of time, but it will be awesome to see how we can improve the health of those who are taking care of us as well.
That's going to be so key for companies like yours. And by the way, innovation that create the creativity to come up with a new business like NutriSense, I mean, it only happens when there's been a failure in the business model of other organizations. So if mainstream medicine doesn't care about testing blood sugar, if the Dietetics Association doesn't care about testing blood sugar, and yet people learn why they need to care about it, that is the birth of new companies. And NutriSense is definitely leading the way, trying to get this in the hands of, I love that your target market is not people with diabetes. They're being taken care of. Insurance is covering their Freestyle Libre if they want one, their insulin pump if they're type 1. But for us schlubs who are just insulin resistant, we don't really have a place to go. My doctor, Tara, no kidding. I went to my doctor trying to get my fasting insulin run. Wouldn't run it.
Yeah.
I'm going, but I'm insulin resistant. I want it to be in the healthy range. And he said, well, you're healthy because you don't have type 2 diabetes. No, I'm on the way to type 2 diabetes unless I see what that number's doing. Now, thankfully, I have a lot of connections and I can run it on my own, and I have run it on my own, and it's down the single digits. And I'm proud of that. But he wouldn't even run it. I had to fire my own doctor. And a lot of patients are caught in the crossfire of that too, of I want to wear a CGM. My doctor won't prescribe one for me because I'm not type 2 diabetic. And so that's kind of the fun part of your company, and other companies that were accompany the same thing, is you're being innovative where there has been a lack of care for some aspect of people's health.
Definitely. And yeah, for people that don't know, these continuous glucose monitors are technically considered a medical device. So you do need a prescription for them, which doesn't make any sense considering you can buy a glucose meter over the counter, and that actually draws blood and has a needle you're using over and over. But for some reason, this device is not okay. But so we obviously think that that's crazy. And I think the world would be such a better place if everyone could wear at least one CGM. I don't even care where you get it, if it's from us or somebody else. But if you have this data for 14 days, you can't deny what's happening inside your body. And that's so informative. So we think everybody should have these at least once. If you have more work to be made, maybe you want to wear a couple, but sometimes just wearing it for 14 days is enough information. And so, yeah, we're trying to remove that barrier to entry for people getting these devices. A lot of our customers, they were super curious about this information. They're not diabetic. They may not even be insulin resistant at all, maybe a little bit of insulin resistance. And they're asking their doctors, and they're all like, that's insane. No. And only 30% of diabetics are actually wearing, 30% of type 2 diabetics are wearing CGMs. So it's not even that widespread in the diabetic community, unfortunately. Doctors are still like, no, you're only on metformin, you're not on insulin, you don't need a CGM. So there's a huge disconnect there of how valuable this information could be for people, diabetic or not. And what's actually happening. So we're trying to make sure all non-diabetics who are curious about themselves, who actually want to take control of their health and prevent chronic conditions, that they have the tools to do that. So we're taking care of all the prescription. We're sending you the device. You don't have to do anything. And then you can put it on at home. You don't have to interact with a physician at all. You just get the data. And related to the fasting insulin, I have a story recently. So I am younger, normal weight, healthy. But I go, every 12 months to my PCP to just get all my labs. I have it in a spreadsheet. I'm very meticulous about tracking things as well. And and I just moved. And so I went to a new doctor, and, we do, all the chitter chatter, and then it goes for labs. And I was like, okay, here's like the extra labs I want. If it's not covered, that's fine. She was like, no, I don't think we need to draw any labs for you. Like, you don't have any risk factors. I think you're fine. And I was like, this isn't, I know, I was like, I'm normally like very nice, but I was very mad. And I was like, this is what an annual physical is for, is to having labs so I can track over time and make sure that I don't get these conditions. I was like, this is very important. I have a family history of all these conditions. I have genetic risk factors. I have 2 copies of the ApoE4 alleles. And I was like, and I've been tracking these over time. I need these. Yeah. And so she's like, I don't think so. It took like 5 minutes back and forth before I was like, I'm not leaving until you order these labs. Like, they're covered by insurance to get once a year. Like, these are mine. I deserve these. And I was like, I could not believe it. And if I didn't know better, if I was just somebody else, you just trust your doctor. You're like, oh, I don't need them. That's fine. And then you don't go back for 10 years because you're like, I don't need them. She said, I don't need to do labs. And then that person might totally miss it. And then 10 years later, they go and get something and it's out of value. And I was just so frustrated. So I feel you.
And at that point, oh, it's genetic, it runs in your family. And so therefore, and they have a convenient kind of cover for their mismanagement of your health. And it's unfortunate with the fasting insulin one for me, also wouldn't run HSCRP, which is a key kind of inflammation marker I keep an eye on as well. It's always really good, right around 1 or less. And so he wouldn't run those numbers. And I'm like, if it's a money thing, I have insurance too, really good insurance. I had to pay for it with Obamacare. And so I got a really nice kind of package. And I have this beautiful insurance that I never get to use because my own doctor won't run the tests that I feel like I need to be optimized in my health. And I'm like, I'll pay for it out of pocket. Is it a money thing? No, you just don't need it. I'm like, but I want the information. I wasn't near as pushy. I just fired him. I just was like, I'm just done.
Yeah, I was like, I'm missing work right now. I could be doing more important things. I'm not leaving until you do this. But it's insane. And everybody should have a fasting insulin. That should be routine preventative lab that everyone's getting. I think it's becoming a little bit more talked about. People are talking about insulin a little bit more. So I'm hoping one day you go to get your labs and at an annual visit and they actually give them to you. And fasting insulin is just included in a regular panel. We're far from that right now, obviously very far from that, but it's super, super important. It's very insightful. A lot of times, fasting insulin might be the very first thing that's rising and all the other labs are normal. It's a very early indicator. Again, it's only in a fasted state, which is why I love the CGM to check those postprandial responses. The best proxy for your postprandial insulin, the best way to do it.
I want to bring up the insulin connection with blood sugar because there is this argument out there that I'm seeing more and more. I know my friend Amy Berger has talked about this, that we don't need to be testing blood sugar so obsessively because the real thing isn't hyperglycemia, but hyperinsulinemia. And your blood sugar can be in a normal range, and yet your insulin, especially if you're insulin resistant, can be way out of range, trying to keep it at that normal range. So how do you respond to people like her that make the claim it's hyperinsulinemia we should be paying attention to, and that the blood sugar is not always a proxy for what that insulin is doing?
Yeah, I would agree with her when it comes to traditional glucose lab values, like the fasting glucose you would get at the doctor or hemoglobin A1C, because these are very lagging. You may have 10 years of insulin resistance damage occurring before you start to see that fasting glucose rise up. Hemoglobin A1C is just your average glucose over 3 months. So you could be having full-blown, insulin resistance, major swings in your glucose up and down, but the average is right in the middle and your A1C looks normal. So I would definitely agree that those are not a great proxy for early insulin resistance, and a fasting insulin is most likely to be out of normal ranges way before those things are. And fasting insulin, for those who are curious, definitely like to see it below 8. Reference ranges depends on what lab you're getting it from, what doctor you're doing it with. You are lucky enough to get it. Seeing it between 2 to 5 is really optimal, but less than 8 in some research studies. But a lot of times they'll come back as a 14, and it'll say it's within normal limits. So yeah, take that with a grain of salt. But I would argue that the data you get from a CGM, continuous glucose data, is much more insightful and much more of a leading indicator for early insulin resistance than those traditional glucose values, because you can see things like your postprandial glucose responses. You can try an at-home 75-gram glucose tolerance test. You could do this you can order pure glucose online, or you could do it with something that's very low fiber, like white rice or white potato, and just do a glucose load and see what that shape looks like. And that's a really early indicator for potential problems with your insulin or insulin resistance.
I will make a caveat. If you're a low carb, keto, or carnivore person, and you're a 3-hour GTT glucose tolerance test, or even a 5-hour one, I've done a 5-hour glucose tolerance test with insulin before, with a low carb meal, because I was getting hypoglycemia and I wanted to see where the points were, and we found it. But if you're doing that, carb up for 3 days before you do that, because you will get a vastly different response to that glucose, to that white rice, that clean, non-fibrous carbohydrate. So make sure you do that. I know it sounds weird. People are like, well, I don't want to carb up. Well, you don't want it to be a false reading, because you're totally burning fat ketones, and you want to shift your body into that glucose mode so you can see what a glucose response would be.
Exactly. Thank you for reminding me of that, Jimmy. That's very important. We have a lot of customers who have come to us that failed this glucose tolerance test during pregnancy. So everybody does it during pregnancy to make sure you don't have gestational diabetes. We have a lot of low carb keto customers who failed this, and their doctors immediately gave them a diagnosis of gestational diabetes. And now they're coming to us and they're like, I want to make sure I'm healthy. And I'm like, okay, well, first let's introduce some carbs and let's try it again at home. And they do perfectly fine. So this is something that needs to be taught to people who are giving these tests to individuals as well, because we're giving people false diagnoses of diabetes when they might be perfectly fine.
And when a woman's pregnant, they're more likely to be in ketosis. That's the other thing that is being taught, that you're going to be in that fat burning mode. So all the more reason to be getting more carbohydrate to lead up to the GTT.
Yes, that's definitely true. So usually it's 100 to 150 grams for about 3 days beforehand. For most people, helps correct this, because your body's in this glucose refusal mode. And so it's just going to reject that and lead to higher glucose values. So you definitely want to correct for that. But with the insulin and glucose relationship, it's not a perfect match every time. It's not every time, glucose is this high, that also means insulin is this high. But it's a very good proxy, and it's the best we have, the CGM data, in a realistic world for our postprandial insulin response. It's the best proxy we have, because to measure, to do the oral glucose tolerance test with insulin, that's not realistic for most people to do, or for most doctors are certainly not going to do that as well. And so this is the best proxy we have. It's not perfect, but it's very close, and it's still very informative.
Well, and in the meantime, while we're waiting on an at-home insulin test, that will be a game changer for the whole industry when that happens. You definitely have a great tool for people. Again, it is NutriSense, you guys. Go check them out over on Instagram. NutriSense.io is their username, and of course NutriSense.io. They give you a 14-day no contract monitor there. You get CGM devices monthly, analytics, run your own experiments, and then access to dietitians like the lovely and talented Kara Collier here today. Thank you so much for being here today. I've been dying to talk to somebody about CGMs, and you were such a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Jimmy.